I have to be honest with you about something, and I genuinely debated, whether to make this video at all. I've been practicing medicine for over 2 decades, and there are certain things you learn in that time that you are expected to quietly set aside. Things that are inconvenient. Things that complicate the simple advice we hand out in 10-minute appointments. But I cannot set this one aside anymore, because millions of people over 60 are doing something every single day, something that feels responsible, something that feels like smart, frugal living. And the reality of what it is doing inside their bodies is something most doctors never bring up. Not because they do not know, because there is simply never enough time. What I am talking about is reheating food. Specifically, 6 foods that most seniors reheat without a second thought. And what my colleagues and I now know, based on research that is sitting in published medical journals right now, is that reheating these particular foods after a certain point in life triggers chemical reactions that release compounds linked directly to cellular damage and increased cancer risk. One of my patients, a 71-year-old retired engineer, had been doing this for years. His inflammation markers told a story he had no idea was being written. I am going to tell you what those 6 foods are, exactly what happens inside your body, and what to do instead. Stay with me. And here is what I should have told my patients years ago, before this became something I had to fit into a confession on a video screen rather than a proper conversation in my office. The problem with reheating food is not just about temperature. That is the part most people get wrong. They think reheating is simply warming something back up, a neutral act, harmless repetition. But your body, particularly your body after 60, does not experience it that way. When certain foods are cooked, they develop compounds called advanced glycation end products, or AGEs. Think of AGEs as a kind of internal rusting process. When you apply heat to proteins and fats together, they bond in an abnormal way, creating molecular debris that your immune system recognizes as a threat. In a younger body, that immune response is relatively efficient. It tags these compounds, neutralizes them, and moves them out. But after 60, that same system, your innate immune response, has slowed considerably. The debris accumulates. The inflammation it triggers becomes low-grade and chronic. And chronic inflammation, as anyone who follows the oncology literature knows, is one of the most consistent upstream conditions linked to cancer development. But AGEs are only part of the story. The other part is something called lipid oxidation, which is basically what happens when healthy fats are broken down by repeated heat exposure and transformed into unstable, damaging molecules called free radicals. Free radicals, think of them as tiny molecular wrecking balls, attack your cell membranes, your mitochondria, and eventually your DNA itself. And here is where it gets worse. Several of the most common foods in a senior's weekly meal rotation are not just susceptible to these reactions, they are almost uniquely vulnerable to them. I had a patient, a warm, practical woman in her late 60s, who prided herself on wasting nothing in her kitchen, who came to me with persistent digestive distress and elevated inflammatory markers that we could not initially explain. When we sat down and went through her diet carefully, a pattern emerged. She was reheating the same 5 or 6 foods multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times in a single day. The foods themselves were not the problem. The chemistry of what was happening to them was. But which foods exactly? And why these specific ones are so much more reactive than others? That part is not as simple as I initially assumed. And it is not something most people are ever told. The part of this story that still bothers me is this. We have had the science on several of these chemical reactions for quite some time. This is not brand new research emerging from a single obscure study. The link between heated and reheated nitrate-rich foods and the formation of compounds called nitrosamines, for example, has been documented in peer-reviewed literature going back decades. Nitrosamines, which form when nitrates are exposed to high heat, particularly in the presence of proteins, are classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer as probable human carcinogens. That is the same body operating under the World Health Organization that classifies processed meats. The same classification system people have heard about. And yet almost no one is talking about what happens when you take something as ordinary as leftover spinach or yesterday's beet salad and heat it up in the microwave. Spinach, beet greens, celery. These foods are extraordinarily high in naturally occurring nitrates, which, in their raw or freshly cooked state, are not inherently harmful. Your body handles them efficiently. But introduce a reheating cycle, and the bacterial activity that begins within hours of initial cooking has already begun converting those nitrates into nitrites. When you then apply heat to nitrite-rich food, particularly in the presence of amino acids from protein, nitrosamines form. And older digestive systems, where stomach acid production has often decreased, where gut microbiome diversity has shifted, are less able to neutralize these compounds before they reach vulnerable tissue. So what is actually happening inside your body at the cellular level when this occurs? Before I answer that fully, I need you to understand something about how your gastrointestinal lining actually works. Most people think of the stomach and intestines as simply a tube that processes food. But the reality is that the mucosal lining of your gut is one of the most metabolically active tissues in your entire body. It replaces itself completely every 3 to 5 days. It is in a constant state of renewal. And that rapid cellular turnover, which is normally a protection mechanism, becomes a liability when carcinogenic compounds are present. Rapidly dividing cells are more vulnerable to DNA disruption. A patient I treated several years ago, a 64-year-old man who had maintained what he genuinely believed was a healthy diet for most of his adult life, had developed a pattern of gastrointestinal inflammation that puzzled his previous care team. He ate well, he exercised, he did not smoke, but he reheated the same vegetable-based dishes 3 and 4 times a week. When we adjusted that single variable, the change in his inflammatory panels over the following months was significant enough that his gastroenterologist commented on it unprompted. The science here is real, and the implications for anyone over 60 go further than most people realize. But the nitrate story is only one layer of what I need you to understand. The deeper layer involves something happening in your oils, your proteins, and something you almost certainly eat every single week. What changed everything for me, and what should change everything for you, is understanding that the danger does not live in exotic or unusual foods. It lives in the ordinary ones, the ones you reach for without thinking. The first food I want you to think about is rice. Specifically, cooked rice that has been left to cool and then reheated. This is something enormous numbers of people over 60 do routinely. Rice seems benign. It seems safe. But cooked rice that cools at room temperature, or even in the refrigerator beyond a certain window, becomes a breeding ground for a bacterium called Bacillus cereus, which produces heat-stable spores. Here is what makes this genuinely alarming. The toxins produced by these spores are not destroyed by reheating. You can bring rice to a full boil and those toxins remain active. Your body, and specifically your liver, which has to process these bacterial endotoxins, takes a measurable hit every time this happens. And after 60, liver enzyme efficiency naturally declines. The liver, think of it as your body's main filtration and detoxification plant, is working at a slower rate than it was at 40. Now consider chicken. Reheated chicken is possibly the most misunderstood food safety issue in this entire conversation. When chicken proteins are exposed to a second round of heat, particularly in a microwave which heats unevenly, you create hot spots and cold spots within the same piece of meat. The hot spots trigger protein denaturation, a process where the molecular structure of the protein is fundamentally altered, generating compounds called heterocyclic amines, or HCAs. HCAs are among the most potent food-derived carcinogens identified in the research literature. The National Cancer Institute has documented the link between HCA formation and increased risk of colorectal, pancreatic, and prostate cancers. And here is the part that genuinely surprised me when I first reviewed this data. The HCA concentration in reheated chicken is measurably higher than in freshly cooked chicken, even when the original cooking method was identical. Reheating amplifies the damage. A patient I cared for, a retired nurse, 68 years old, which I mentioned because she was medically literate and still did not know this, told me she had been reheating chicken multiple times a week for years because she was cooking for one and trying to be practical. She was doing everything else right. This one habit had been compounding quietly in the background. But rice and chicken are not where this story ends. There are 4 more foods on this list, and one of them, I would guess, is sitting in your refrigerator right now. I wish I had known this sooner, because the truth about the remaining foods on this list is that their risk is rooted in chemistry so specific that it almost has to be explained to be believed. The third food is eggs. Reheated eggs, scrambled eggs from yesterday, hard-boiled eggs warmed back up, undergo what is called protein cross-linking when subjected to repeated heat. The proteins in eggs are highly sensitive to temperature change. When you cook an egg, you are already denaturing those proteins significantly. When you reheat them, you push that denaturation further, and in the process, you generate new sulfur compounds that your gut bacteria respond to with increased fermentation. In seniors, where intestinal permeability, sometimes called leaky gut, is already more common, these compounds can pass more readily through the gut wall and enter systemic circulation. Your immune system mounts a response. That response, repeated over weeks and months, becomes a driver of chronic, low-grade inflammation. The fourth food is potatoes, specifically cooked potatoes, boiled, mashed, roasted, that have been left to cool and then reheated at high temperatures. Potatoes are high in starch. When that starch is cooked and then cooled, it converts into what is called resistant starch, which is actually beneficial in many ways. But when you reheat those potatoes aggressively, especially in an oven or microwave at high heat, you trigger the formation of acrylamide. Acrylamide, a compound that forms when starchy foods are subjected to dry, high heat, is classified by the International Agency for Research on Cancer as a probable human carcinogen. It has been linked in animal studies, and increasingly in human epidemiological research, to kidney, endometrial, and ovarian cancer risk. The fifth food is mushrooms. This one surprises almost everyone. Mushrooms contain complex proteins and a category of compounds called purines that break down rapidly after cooking. Reheated mushrooms, especially if left at room temperature for more than 2 hours before reheating, develop bacterial colonies far more quickly than most vegetables. And the resulting compounds stress your kidneys in ways that are particularly meaningful for seniors whose renal filtration rates have naturally declined. I had a patient, a 72-year-old woman, who ate what she described as a very clean diet, who was struggling with recurring digestive issues and elevated uric acid levels. Mushrooms, reheated frequently, were a factor no one had thought to ask about. And the sixth food is one that will surprise you most of all. I am going to explain it fully, what it is, why it is so reactive, and exactly what to do about it, right now. What I should have told my patients years ago is that knowing the danger is only useful if you know what to do with that knowledge. So let me make this practical and clear. The sixth food is leafy green vegetables, specifically spinach, kale, and Swiss chard, which are among the highest nitrate-containing foods in any kitchen. As I described earlier, the nitrate to nitrite conversion begins within hours of cooking. But what I did not yet mention is that spinach in particular contains oxalates, compounds that bind to minerals in your body and, when exposed to repeated heat cycles, form calcium oxalate crystals that the kidneys must work to excrete. In a younger kidney, this is manageable. In a kidney operating at 60, 70, or 80% of its original efficiency, this is a real and recurring burden. So what do? First, cook only what you plan to eat in that single sitting whenever possible. I understand that this conflicts with how many people manage meals, particularly those cooking alone or on a fixed schedule. But it is the single most important adjustment you can make. Second, if you must store cooked food, cool it rapidly and refrigerate it within 1 hour of cooking. Do not leave it on the counter to cool slowly at room temperature. Bacterial activity accelerates dramatically in that window between 140 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit, what food scientists call the danger zone. Third, when reheating is unavoidable, choose lower heat for a longer time rather than blasting food at maximum microwave power. Gentler, more even heat reduces the formation of heterocyclic amines in proteins and slows acrylamide formation in starches. Fourth, and this is something almost no one mentions, add an acid when reheating if possible. A small amount of lemon juice or apple cider vinegar added to reheated rice, vegetables, or eggs actually changes the chemical environment enough to partially inhibit nitrosamine formation. This is not a complete solution, but it is a real, measurable reduction in reactivity. I had a patient, a 69-year-old man who had initially been skeptical of everything I was telling him, who made these 4 adjustments over the course of 2 months. His C-reactive protein levels, which are a direct blood marker of systemic inflammation, dropped by nearly 30%. He told me, with genuine disbelief in his voice, that he had changed nothing else. Not his exercise, not his medications, just the way he was handling his food. That story is not unique in my practice, not even close. But there is still one more layer to this, and it involves what you do with the knowledge you now have. What comes next is about you specifically, and I want you to hear this part carefully because this is where the practical advice becomes personal. If you are over 60, your body is not processing these chemical compounds the way it did 20 years ago. That is not a criticism, it is biology. Your liver's phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification pathways, think of these as a two-stage filtration system, like a water treatment facility that cleans and then neutralizes contaminants, operate at measurably reduced efficiency as you age. Research published through the National Institutes of Health confirms that hepatic blood flow decreases by approximately 40% between the ages of 40 and 70. This means that the same quantity of toxins that your body handled efficiently at 40 requires more time, more cellular resources, and more enzymatic activity to process at 65. This is why the foods I have described are specifically more concerning for seniors. Not because younger people are immune to these compounds, but because the biological margin for error is meaningfully narrower after 60. Beyond the liver, your DNA repair mechanisms also slow. The process called nucleotide excision repair, which is your cell's built-in ability to detect and fix damaged DNA segments before they become cancerous mutations, becomes less efficient with age. This is documented. This is not speculation. And it means that the protective buffer your body once had between exposure to a carcinogenic compound and actual cellular harm has gotten smaller. So the question becomes, and this is one I ask myself as a physician regularly, how do we help the body protect itself given this new reality? The answers include everything I described in the last section, but they also include something simpler that I want to add here: hydration. Adequate water intake, at least 64 ounces daily for most seniors, adjusted for kidney function, significantly supports both hepatic detoxification and renal excretion of the oxalates and uric acid compounds released from improperly reheated foods. A patient I treated, a 66-year-old woman who was meticulous about every other aspect of her health, was chronically mildly dehydrated, and we had not connected that to the pattern of inflammation we were seeing until we looked at the full picture together. If you have ever been told by a doctor that reheating food was completely safe, that it was just about temperature and bacteria, and you are now realizing that the full story is considerably more complicated than that, I want you to type the word SAME in the comments. Because the gap between what patients are told and what the research actually shows is something I think about every single day. And you are not alone in having trusted a simpler version of the truth. You just spent real time with something that most people will never know. And I want you to understand what that means. The information in this video is not fringe science. It is not alarmist content designed to frighten you into changing everything about how you live. It is documented, published, peer-reviewed biochemistry applied to the specific physiological realities of aging, laid out plainly the way I wish more doctors had the time to do in the clinic. You sat through the hard parts. The chemistry of nitrosamines, the behavior of Bacillus cereus in cooled rice, the way acrylamide forms in reheated starches, the declining efficiency of your liver's detoxification pathways, the narrowing DNA repair window that makes all of this matter more after 60 than it did before. You did not look away, and that tells me something about who you are and why you are watching. I made this video because I kept seeing the same quiet pattern in my own practice, in the published research I follow closely, and honestly, in conversations with people I care about deeply who had no idea any of this was happening. The harm here is not dramatic and sudden. It is slow. It is cumulative. It is the kind of damage that shows up years later as a diagnosis that feels like it came from nowhere, when in fact it came from the accumulation of 1,000 ordinary mornings. That is the part that stays with me. That is why I made this, rather than staying quiet about it, the way it would have been easier to do. I want you healthy. Not just managing, not just maintaining, actually healthy in the full and meaningful sense of that word. That matters to me beyond what I can really articulate in a video. So if something here felt familiar, if you recognized your own kitchen in something I described, please share this with someone in your life who needs to hear it. A spouse, a sibling, a friend who lives alone and cooks the way all of us were taught to cook. Sometimes the most important thing one person can do for another is simply pass along the right information at the right moment. And if you want to keep learning together, honestly, carefully, without the noise, stay with us. I will be here.